Is there any proof from Scripture of the infallibility of the Church of Rome? Not a syllable. If anywhere, we might expect to find it in the Epistle to the Romans, but St. Paul, so far from saying a single syllable about this pretended infallibility, actually cautions the Romans against falling away from the faith. Is there any proof from history? Nothing of the sort. History exhibits Pope against Pope, council against council, the Roman Church of one age against the Roman Church of another age. Where was infallibility when at one single time there were three popes, each claiming to be infallible and each cursing the other as an undoubted limb of Antichrist? Where was infallibility when the present pope and a long line of his predecessors severally claimed to be universal bishops and the center of unity, while Pope Gregory I had actually declared that the person who, in the elation of his heart, should call himself, or even desire to be called, universal bishop, was the forerunner of Antichrist? If Gregory was right, what are we to think of his successors? If wrong, what becomes of infallibility? But this is not all. Not only does this infallible church contradict itself, it likewise again and again contradicts and opposes and sets aside Scripture. Now, Scripture we know to be infallible. Therefore, it is a palpable contradiction in terms to assert that this barefaced contradiction of Scripture is also infallible. Furthermore, if the Roman Church were infallible, it would be easy to point out the organ by which the decrees of this infallibility are communicated. Yet some declare it to be the Pope speaking ex cathedra, others a general or ecumenical council concurrently with the Pope, others a general council, such as that of Constance, independently of the Pope, and even opposed to him. Has your nephew ascertained the locality of that infallibility respecting which he speaks so confidently? Or if he thinks he has, why are we to prefer his alleged locality to the alleged locality of another speculatist, unless he be himself personally infallible? This brings me to the last difficulty with which this ridiculous absurdity is hampered. Even if the Roman Church were infallible, and even if the organ of its infallibility could be infallibly determined by some infallible investigator, still I say, when we had it, not the slightest use could we derive from it in the way of what Dr. Milner very amusingly calls the end of controversy, unless every Romish individual were himself infallible likewise. Without this necessary personal infallibility, how can your nephew be infallibly certain that he attaches its true sense to an infallible decision of the infallible Church? Both respecting transubstantiation and the invocation of saints and the use of images, Roma locuta est, but not therefore causa finita est. Rome has spoken, but not therefore the cause is finished. Can your nephew, or any Romanist, infallibly tell me whether in the alleged process of transubstantiation the elements are absolutely annihilated, or whether they are only removed to some other place so as to make room for the body and blood and divinity and soul of Christ, which are then substituted in their place? Or whether in the same process the elements are transmuted into the body and soul and blood and divinity of Christ, somewhat in the same fashion as the old alchemists imagined that an inferior metal might be transmuted into gold? Perhaps it may be thought that the last of the three speculations bids fairest to be the sense of the council, but still, unless he can be infallibly certain how, so far as respects the modus operandi, he ought to understand and receive the infallible decision, he may, notwithstanding the great benefit of ecclesiastical infallibility, be himself a damnable heretic. Again, can he be infallibly certain that he understands the infallible decision touching the invocation and veneration and relics of saints and sacred images as given in the 25th session of the Infallible Council of Trent? Can he define infallibly the precise intended amount of the legitimate use of images, or the precise intended extent of the due honor and veneration which the Infallible Council charges all good Christians to pay to images? Unless he can do this, he can never be infallibly certain that he is not a heretic. For if he depart one tittle or one poor scruple from the sense of the infallible counsel, he falls into heresy. The varying practice of Romanists themselves shows that they are not unanimous in their understanding the true import of the council's decision. Such being the case, how are they the wiser for the infallibility of their church? Clearly, they cannot benefit from it unless every single individual of them be himself personally infallible. Your nephew may peradventure say that we may be morally certain of the true sense of an infallible decision, just as we may be morally certain of the true sense of Scripture. If he says this, he at once cuts up popery by the roots and falls himself into a flat paralogism. The constant language of Rome is that we cannot be even morally certain of the true sense of Scripture, and therefore that we need the infallible interpretation of that infallible church. And this is plainly the drift of your nephew's language. Yet here lies his gross paralogism. We cannot, forsooth, be morally certain of the true sense of Scripture, but we may be morally certain of the true sense of an infallible decision or interpretation. Nor is even this the whole amount of the paralogism. Moral certainty is not infallible certainty, and unless your nephew be infallible, he can never be more than morally certain as to the true sense of a Romish decision. In other words, he can claim no higher certainty as to the true sense of a pretended infallible decision than we of the English Church claim as to the true sense of a really infallible text of Scripture. Under such circumstances, how does he profit more from the pretended infallibility of the Romish Church than from the real infallibility of the Bible? And how, in going over to popery, will he gain a single advantage as to infallible certainty which he does not equally possess already?